People love to say that blood is thicker than water. That family will always be your safe place, your anchor. The one thing you can count on when the rest of the world turns against you. If you believe that, I need you to sit down and listen, because I used to believe it too, and believing that lie nearly destroyed me. My name is Evelyn Price. I was born in 1953 in a quiet little town in Georgia. The kind of place where neighbors waved from porches, church bells rang every Sunday, and everyone liked to pretend they knew everyone else's business. I am 72 years old now, with more years behind me than ahead. Yet when I close my eyes at night, I can still smell the mildew of the old wallpaper in my childhood bedroom. Still hear the heavy footsteps in the hallway, still feel the cold dread that wrapped around me like chains. Memories like that never fade. They carve themselves into your bones, and for decades I carried them in silence. Today, sitting on the porch of my little house while the cicadas hum in the trees and the air hangs heavy with summer heat, I've decided it's finally time to tell the story I've hidden since I was a girl. It's not going to be pretty. If you've come looking for a fairy tale, this isn't the place. But if you've ever been told to stay quiet, if you've ever felt trapped in your own home, if you've ever been betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect you, then maybe my story will sound familiar. Maybe it will remind you that survival is possible. Before I begin, I want to ask something small from you. If my story reaches you, if it stirs something inside, please let me know in the comments where you're from. I want to see how far this little voice of mine can travel. And if you can, give this video a like and subscribe. It's not just numbers, it's a way of telling me that my words matter. Every comment, every like, every share gives me strength to keep talking about the things people like to sweep under the rug. I grew up in a small 3-room house on the edge of town. My father, William Price, was the king of that little kingdom. He worked at the lumber mill, came home covered in sawdust and sweat, with whiskey already burning in his breath before the sun went down. He believed men were made to rule, women were made to serve, and children were made to obey. My mother, Ruth, tried to soften the edges of his temper, but she was a small woman with a soft voice, and he had a way of drowning her out. And then there was Thomas, my older brother, 5 years ahead of me. Tall, dark-haired, with a grin that made neighbors call him handsome. To me, when I was little, he was everything. He taught me to climb trees, to skip rocks across the creek, to ride my bike without training wheels. I wanted his approval more than anything. If Thomas said I did good, I felt like I had worth. But things change. Or maybe they don't really change, they just reveal themselves. Looking back, I see the signs were always there. The way my father praised Thomas like he was the second coming while treating me like an afterthought. The way my mother looked away whenever Thomas pushed me too hard or teased me in ways that made my stomach knot. At 7, I couldn't put words to it. All I knew was that I was afraid. Afraid of father's belt. Afraid of Thomas's sudden moods. Afraid of saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. Afraid that maybe, deep down, I was exactly what father called me, a mistake. One night in April, a storm rolled in. The rain pounded the roof like it wanted to break through, thunder rattling the walls. I was in bed hugging my ragged teddy bear when the door creaked open. It was Thomas. He slipped into my bed, shivering dramatically, saying he was scared of the thunder. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But even then, some part of me knew his fear wasn't real. The way he smiled in the dark, the way his arm draped around me too tightly, it didn't feel like comfort. It felt like a trap. Still, I stayed silent, because silence was safer than speaking. That was the first time I truly understood what it meant to be alone in a house, full of people. People in town thought we were a normal family. Father worked hard. Mother kept the house clean. Thomas was the golden boy who played baseball. And I was the quiet little girl who trailed behind. Teachers said I was shy but smart. Neighbors said I was polite. They didn't know that quiet wasn't my nature, it was my shield. Quiet girls didn't get noticed. And in my house, not being noticed was the safest thing in the world. There was one Easter Sunday when I was 8. My mother sewed me a light blue dress from scraps, and for a moment I felt pretty. An older lady at church told me I was growing into a lovely young lady, and I blushed. But when I glanced at Thomas, his face was hard, his jaw clenched. On the ride home, he said nothing. Later, he cornered me in the hallway, his voice low and sharp. Don't get ideas. You think you're special just because someone called you pretty? You're mine, nobody else's. Remember that? I didn't fully understand, but the way his eyes locked on mine made me feel cold. My mother walked past us right then, saw us standing there, saw the fear on my face, and she looked away. That was the moment I realized she knew. She always knew. And her silence wasn't ignorance. It was fear that night. I lay in bed staring at the cracks in the ceiling, listening to the house breathe. The drip of the faucet, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards as Thomas moved from one room to another. Each sound felt like a warning. I was only 8, but I understood something most children should never understand. Sometimes the monsters don't live under your bed. They live in the room next to you. Father didn't see it that way. To him, Thomas could do no wrong. He bragged about him constantly. That boy's going places. Strong as an ox, smart as a whip. He's the kind of son a man dreams of. When it came to me, his words cut deep. This one was an accident, he'd say, jerking his thumb at me during barbecues. God must have been half asleep when he made her. People laughed, and I laughed too, because that's what was expected. But inside, every word hollowed me out. I tried once to tell my mother. She was at the sink, hands buried in suds. "Mama," I whispered, "Thomas makes me feel wrong." She froze, her shoulders stiffening, then sighed. "It's in your head, honey. Your brother loves you. He just wants to protect you." She wouldn't look at me, and I understood she wasn't protecting him. She was protecting herself from my father's wrath, and from the truth she couldn't face. That was the night something inside me cracked. If my own mother wouldn't hear me, who else would? From then on, I lived in two worlds. The world outside where I was the polite, quiet girl who smiled and got good grades, and the world inside where I counted the seconds between Thomas's footsteps and prayed he wouldn't stop at my door. People sometimes ask me how I survived. The truth is, I made myself small, invisible. I thought if I could just disappear, maybe the storm would pass. But storms don't pass when you live inside them. They circle and circle, waiting to strike again. The first time I truly felt powerless came one summer evening when I was 9. Father sat drinking on the porch while Thomas and I fetched water from the pump. I tripped and spilled the bucket, and Thomas shoved me to the dirt, hissing, "Remember what I told you? You're mine." Back at the house, my knees bloodied. Father didn't ask questions. He never did. My mother looked at me, saw the scrape, the tears, and then she looked away. Always away. That night I stared at the ceiling and wondered if Father was right. Maybe I was a mistake. Maybe God himself had looked down and decided I wasn't worth saving. By 10, I had learned to bathe with my clothes on, to wedge a chair under the doorknob at night, to smile at neighbors so they wouldn't suspect. I wasn't fine, though I said I was. I was a child in a prison no one else could see. The bruises I tried to cover, the flinches I couldn't hide. No one noticed. Or maybe they noticed and chose not to see. In towns like ours, people preferred to believe in happy families. Sometimes I whispered to myself at night, clutching my teddy bear, "Hold on, someday you'll get out." Freedom was just a dream, but it kept me alive. Once, my neighbor Mrs. Carter told me quiet girls grow into strong women. I wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that my silence wasn't weakness but survival. Yet that very night, Thomas slipped into my room again, and whatever spark her words had given me was smothered. I wish I could tell you that someone came to rescue me. That part 1 of my story ends with freedom, but no one came. So I survived the only way I could, by disappearing into myself, by making my body small and my voice smaller, by promising myself that one day, somehow, I'd get out of that house. That promise became the thread that stitched me together. And though it would take years of silence and fear, that little thread never snapped. So if you are listening right now, if you're in your own house counting footsteps in the hallway, if you're wondering if anyone will believe you, hear me. You're not imagining it. You're not alone. And you're not weak for being afraid. You are surviving. And that survival, no matter how small it feels, is strength. Please let me know in the comments where you're from. Every like, every share, every comment helps me keep telling this truth. Because the more people hear, the less silence wins. That's where my story begins. A little girl in a Georgia town, trapped in a house that was supposed to be home but felt like hell, with no allies and no way out except for the promise she made to herself on those long, sleepless nights. That promise is the reason I am here to tell you the rest. And in the next part of my story, you'll see how that promise carried me through the years when the darkness grew heavier, when the secrets became impossible to hide, and when silence turned into something far more dangerous. Asterisk, when I turned 11, something inside me shifted. Childhood is supposed to be a time when the world feels wide open, when days stretch long and lazy, filled with sunlight and discovery. For me, those years narrowed into survival. Every sound, every glance, every shadow in the hallway became a code to decipher. Was tonight safe? Would Thomas leave me alone? Would Father come home drunk and raging? Would Mother hide behind the curtain of her silence? Childhood for me was not innocence. It was strategy. That summer, our town seemed to hum with life. The ice cream truck rattled down Main Street. Kids played baseball in dusty lots. Fireflies glowed in the dark like tiny lanterns. On the surface, it was beautiful, but I watched it all from behind a glass wall. Other children laughed freely, unafraid of what waited at home. I envied them more than I can ever explain. Sometimes I'd sit on the curb outside our house, pretending I was part of their world, until Thomas's voice would slice through the air, "Get inside," and just like that, the illusion shattered. School became my only refuge. The classrooms smelled of chalk and pencil shavings. The teachers' voices droned on about history and arithmetic, and to me, that was bliss. I sat in the front row, eager to escape into numbers and words, into a place where logic made sense. My teachers praised me, called me bright, said I had potential. Those words felt like drops of water on cracked soil. I clung to them. They were proof that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the mistake Father said I was, but the safety of school ended the moment I stepped off the bus. The dirt road home stretched out like a path into a storm, and at the end of it stood our house, with its peeling paint and sagging porch, holding secrets no one dared to name. By the time I was 12, Thomas had grown into a young man. His voice had deepened, his shoulders broadened, and with that, his sense of control over me seemed to grow. He no longer pretended to be the protective brother in front of me. He knew I was too afraid to tell, and he relished that power. One evening, as I tried to sneak a piece of cornbread before dinner, he cornered me in the kitchen. His grip on my arm was bruising, his whisper sharp as a knife. "Remember what I told you? You're mine. If you ever say otherwise, you'll regret it." I looked over his shoulder, praying my mother would appear in the doorway. She did. For one flicker of a second, her eyes met mine. She saw his hand clamped on my arm, saw the fear twisting my face, and then she turned and walked away. The silence of her retreat echoed louder than any scream. That was the night I stopped believing she might save me. My father remained blind, or maybe willfully ignorant. He bragged to neighbors about Thomas's strength, his skill on the baseball field, his leadership. When it came to me, his words cut like glass. "This girl's too quiet, too soft. She never amount to much." He never saw the way Thomas's shadow stretched over me. Or maybe he did and chose not to see. Men like him didn't want to admit rot could grow inside their own walls. At 13, my body began to change, and with it came a new kind of danger. The way Thomas looked at me shifted. It wasn't just about power anymore, it was possession. His stares lingered too long, his words grew sharper, more twisted. I wore oversized sweaters in the heat of summer just to make myself invisible, but nothing made me invisible to him. One Sunday afternoon, after church, a boy named Daniel walked me home. He was kind, with sandy hair and a smile that made me feel, for once, like I was just a girl and not a shadow. He carried my Bible, asked about school, told me I was smart. It was innocent, pure in the way only young friendships can be. But Thomas saw. That night, he stormed into my room, his face twisted with rage. "You think you can belong to someone else?" he hissed. "Don't you forget to mine?" His fist slammed against the wall, inches from my head. The plaster cracked. I didn't sleep that night. I thought about telling Daniel, about confiding in someone, anyone, but the fear of being called a liar, of making things worse, kept my mouth shut. Secrets grow heavy, and mine weighed more with each passing day. By 14, I learned to live in fragments. At school, I was Evelyn, the smart girl. At church, I was Evelyn, the polite girl. At home, I was Evelyn, the silent girl. No one ever saw the whole of me. That hidden part, the wounded part, was locked away where no one could touch it. Survival demanded it. One summer evening, sitting under the pecan tree in our yard, I made myself a promise. I don't know why that night was different. Maybe because the air was so still, it felt like the world was holding its breath. I whispered to myself, "Someday you'll get out. Someday you'll be free." It was a fragile promise, born out of desperation, but it was enough. It gave me something to hold on to when the nights felt endless and the shadows pressed too close. My mother's silence haunted me most. Sometimes, late at night, I would hear her crying softly in her room. She knew she had to know, but she was too afraid to break the fragile illusion of our family. Her fear became my inheritance. I learned early that speaking the truth could shatter everything, and so I swallowed it whole. The older I grew, the clearer it became. That silence was killing me. It wrapped around me like a shroud, suffocating and heavy. But still, I said nothing, because in that house, silence was safer than truth. There was a night, just before my 15th birthday, when I nearly broke. Thomas had cornered me again, his voice low and venomous, his grip bruising my wrist. In that moment, I wanted to scream, to claw, to run, but Father was in the next room and Mother was setting the table. And I knew if I screamed, they wouldn't save me. They'd tell me to hush, to stop making trouble. So I stayed silent. Again, that's how silence became my curse. Not just imposed on me, but chosen because the truth was too dangerous. And yet, even as it suffocated me, that small voice deep inside whispered, "Hold on, one day you'll escape. One day you'll tell your story. One day, silence will lose." That day didn't come in my teenage years. Not yet, but the cracks were forming. The facade of our perfect family was starting to crumble, piece by piece. And though I didn't know it then, the storm brewing inside our house would one day tear everything apart. The autumn I turned 15, school became both a refuge and a torment. I loved the quiet hum of the library, the neat rows of books that smelled like dust and promise, the scratch of my pencil on fresh paper. But even there, the whispers of classmates crept in. Why is she always so quiet? Why doesn't she ever come to the dances? I wanted to tell them everything, that silence wasn't a choice, but a prison, but I only smiled weakly and kept my head down. To them, I was just the shy girl. No one knew that at home. My silence was survival. There was one teacher, though, who seemed to see through me, Mrs. Whitaker. My English teacher, with her soft gray eyes and voice like honey, once pulled me aside after class. "Evelyn, you're a remarkable writer," she said, holding one of my essays as if it were something precious. "But you write about pain in a way most girls your age don't. Are you all right, child?" Her question hung in the air like a lifeline. For one fleeting second, I considered telling her everything about Thomas, about the nights that stretched like endless corridors, about my mother's silence and my father's blindness. My throat ached with the truth, but then fear wrapped its cold hand around me. What if she didn't believe me? What if she told my parents? What if it made things worse? I forced a smile and said, "I'm fine, ma'am." She looked at me a long time, as if she knew I was lying, but she didn't press. I left her classroom that day with my chest heavy and my heart screaming at me for staying silent once again. I tried to find solace in friends, but closeness felt dangerous. There was one girl, Clara, who sat next to me in history class. She was bright, full of laughter, with hair that caught the sunlight like copper. She invited me to her house one Friday afternoon. Her mother greeted us with warm cookies. Her father ruffled her hair affectionately, and her little brother trailed us into her room, giggling. It was ordinary, the kind of family life most kids took for granted, but to me, it was like stepping into another universe. Watching Clara's parents laugh together, watching the way they looked at her with nothing but love, I wanted to weep. That night, back in my own house with its heavy air and dark corners, the contrast was unbearable. Thomas noticed when I started spending more time with Clara. He asked questions, sharp and prying. "Who is she? What do you talk about? Do you tell her about us?" I shook my head, terrified. "No, I swear." But his suspicion grew and his anger with it. One night after supper, he caught me in the hallway and shoved me hard against the wall. "Don't you ever forget you're mine? If you think you can run off with friends and leave me behind, you'll regret it." His eyes burned with something that was no longer just jealousy. It was obsession. I began pulling away from Clara, from everyone. It was safer to be alone. Safer to live in that small, suffocating bubble Thomas allowed me. My world shrank to the size of that house. Even though I longed for something more, when I was 16, the weight of it all nearly crushed me. The nights grew darker, the silence thicker. I started writing in secret, filling notebooks with words I could never say aloud. My pen became my only friend, the pages my confessional. I wrote about fear, about anger, about the small flicker of hope I clung to. I wrote about wanting to scream so loud the whole town would hear, about wanting someone, anyone, to see me. Those notebooks were hidden under a loose floorboard in my room. My only act of rebellion. If Thomas ever found them, I don't know what he would have done. But writing was the only way I survived. One night I almost broke. Thomas cornered me in the kitchen after everyone had gone to bed. His grip on my arm was so tight, I thought the bone would snap. "You think you can hide from me?" he hissed, his breath hot and sour. "You think anyone would believe you over me? You're nothing. You're nobody. Without me, you're just a ghost." His words sank into me like poison. For a moment, I believed him. I thought maybe he was right, that I was invisible, that no one would ever care enough to see the truth. I went to my room that night and stared at the ceiling for hours. A razor blade I'd stolen from the bathroom cabinet lay hidden under my pillow. I thought about ending it, about slipping into silence forever. The thought was terrifying, but also strangely comforting. No more fear, no more secrets, no more being trapped. But then, in the darkness, I heard my own voice whisper the promise I'd made under the pecan tree years before. "Someday, you'll get out. Someday, you'll be free." That fragile thread of hope pulled me back from the edge. I hid the blade away and clung to that whisper like it was the only thing keeping me alive. By 17, the facade of our family began to show cracks. Even outsiders noticed. My father drank more heavily, coming home late and stumbling through the door, his temper more violent than ever. My mother grew thinner, her eyes hollow, her silence deeper. Thomas strutted through town like a king, admired by neighbors and teachers. But behind closed doors, his control over me tightened. I was suffocating, but no one saw. Or maybe they didn't want to. People in small towns don't like to look too closely at what happens behind other people's doors. There was one night, late in the summer of my 17th year, that marked a turning point. Father had come home drunk, his rage boiling over about some imagined slight at work. He slapped Mother across the face, and she fell against the counter, a thin line of blood trickling from her lip. I stood frozen, watching, my chest heaving with rage. And for the first time, Thomas stepped in, not to protect her, but to shield Father. to play the loyal son. He pulled me aside, his grip bruising my arm, and hissed, "Don't you dare say a word. This is family business. You belong to us, Evelyn. Don't ever forget." That night, lying awake, I realized something that chilled me. Thomas wasn't just my tormentor. He was becoming my father's mirror image. The cycle was repeating, and if I didn't find a way out, it would consume me too. It was around that time I began secretly planning my escape. It wasn't much of a plan, just vague dreams scribbled in the margins of my notebooks. Maybe I could get a scholarship. Maybe I could work after school and save a little money. Maybe Clara, though we'd grown apart, could help me. I didn't know how or when, but I knew I couldn't stay still. Fear clung to me. Every time I thought about running, Thomas's voice echoed in my head. "You're mine. No one will believe you. You're nothing without me." But another voice, quieter yet stronger, began to rise inside me. "You're not his. You're not nothing. You're more than this house. More than this silence." And that battle between the two voices, fear and hope, became the rhythm of my life. By the time I turned 18, the storm inside our house was reaching a breaking point. The tension between my parents, the growing violence, the darkness in Thomas's eyes, it was all building to something inevitable. I didn't know it then, but the years of silence were about to explode. And when they did, nothing would ever be the same. Turning 18 should have felt like freedom. For most girls my age, it meant planning dances, dreaming of college, maybe falling in love. For me, it was like standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down at the jagged rocks of my past, wondering if I could ever truly leap away from them. Legally, I was an adult, but inside, I still felt like that small, terrified child pressing herself into the corner of her room, praying for the storm to pass. Graduation day was supposed to be a celebration. My classmates tossed their caps into the air, families cheered, and cameras flashed. But when I walked across that stage to collect my diploma, the only claps I heard were perfunctory. My father sat stiff in the bleachers, his jaw tight, his hands folded. My mother dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, but whether it was pride or shame, I couldn't tell. Thomas didn't even come. Baseball practice, he claimed, though I suspected it was more about reminding me that nothing I accomplished mattered without his permission. After the ceremony, as I stood alone with my rolled-up diploma in hand, Mrs. Whitaker, my English teacher, found me. She smiled warmly, her gray eyes glistening with tears. "Evelyn, I hope you know how extraordinary you are," she said, squeezing my shoulder. "You could do great things if you keep going." Her words made me want to cry. Extraordinary? Me. I didn't feel extraordinary. I felt broken, trapped. But her faith in me lit a small candle in the darkness. I held onto it as I walked back to the car with my parents, where silence pressed between us like another body. That summer, I worked long hours at the diner on Main Street. Grease clung to my clothes. My hands smelled of coffee and dish soap, but I didn't mind. Every dollar I earned went into a tin box I kept hidden beneath a loose board in my room. The same place I'd hidden my notebooks all those years. The box became my symbol of escape. With each coin, each folded bill, I felt closer to freedom. Thomas didn't like it. He accused me of thinking I was better than the family, of plotting to leave him behind. His jealousy had shifted into something darker, more consuming. "You'll never make it out there without me," he snarled one night, his face inches from mine. "The world will eat you alive. You need me." But I didn't need him, not anymore. I was beginning to see that the only thing keeping me bound to him was fear, and fear, though powerful, could be fought. I clutched the edges of my tin box at night and whispered to myself, "You will leave. You will." My mother's silence grew heavier during those years. Sometimes I caught her staring at me with eyes that seemed almost apologetic, as if she wished she could undo everything but didn't know how. Once, late at night when Father was snoring in his chair, she came into my room and sat on the edge of my bed. She smoothed my hair with trembling fingers and whispered, "I'm sorry, Evelyn. I should have protected you." The words startled me. It was the closest she'd ever come to acknowledging the truth. Tears pricked my eyes, but before I could answer, she pressed a finger to her lips and slipped away into the shadows. That tiny crack in her silence gave me both comfort and sorrow. Comfort that she knew, sorrow that she still chose fear over action. When I finally told Thomas I was applying to college, his fury shook the walls of our house. He slammed his fist onto the table, his green eyes blazing. "You're not leaving me," he growled. "You think you can just walk away? You belong here. You belong to me." For the first time, I stood my ground. My voice trembled, but it came out steady enough. "I don't belong to you, Thomas. I never did." The silence that followed was deafening. My father looked up from his whiskey glass, his brows furrowed. "What's this about?" he barked. But Thomas only glared at me, his jaw tight, his hands clenched. He didn't tell Father the truth, of course. He couldn't. Instead, he stormed out of the room, the slam of the door rattling the windows that night. I slept with my tin box clutched against my chest, as if it were a shield. I applied to a small community college in Knoxville. Just far enough away to feel like freedom, but close enough that I didn't need much money. When the acceptance letter arrived, I locked myself in the bathroom to read it, tears streaming down my face. For the first time in my life, the future didn't feel like a death sentence. It felt like possibility. But Thomas wasn't done with me. In the weeks leading up to my departure, his presence became suffocating. He cornered me in hallways, hissed threats in my ear, left bruises on my wrists. "If you leave, I'll find you," he warned. "You can't escape me." I wanted to believe he was wrong, but fear still coiled inside me. What if he did follow me? What if no matter where I went, his shadow trailed me? On the morning I left for Knoxville, my father barely acknowledged me. "Don't waste our money," he muttered, though he hadn't given me a cent. My mother hugged me briefly at the door, her arms frail, her voice shaking. "Be safe," she whispered. Her eyes glistened with tears, but she didn't say anything more. Thomas didn't come to say goodbye. But as I loaded my suitcase into the bus and turned to take one last look at the house, I saw him standing in the upstairs window, his face pale, his eyes burning into me. The sight chilled me to my core. His glare wasn't sadness or loss, it was possession, fury, a silent promise that he would not let me go easily. The bus pulled away, the town fading behind me, and for the first time in my life, I breathed air that felt like my own. Knoxville rose before me like a new world, full of noise and people and freedom. But even as I stepped into that freedom, I carried the shadows with me. The past clung to me like a second skin, whispering that escape was never truly simple. In college, I learned quickly that independence wasn't just about distance. It was about unlearning years of silence. I struggled to make friends, to trust anyone. When classmates invited me to parties, I made excuses. The idea of closeness still terrified me, but I loved my classes. I buried myself in literature and psychology, in words that made sense of pain and patterns. For the first time, I felt like my voice mattered even, if I only spoke it on paper. And yet, Thomas's voice haunted me. Some nights, when the dorm was quiet and the world outside seemed peaceful, I'd hear his whisper in my mind. "You're mine. You can't escape me." I'd wake from nightmares with my heart pounding, convinced he was standing at the foot of my bed, but I was out. For the first time, I was truly out. And though the fear lingered, though the shadows followed, that fragile thread of hope grew stronger, because now, I wasn't just whispering to myself that someday I'd be free. Now, I was beginning to live it. At first, college felt like stepping into sunlight after years underground, but the light was blinding. I didn't know how to exist without the constant weight of someone else's rules pressing down on me. My dorm mates laughed easily, invited me to late-night pizza runs, shared secrets like it was nothing. I wanted to join them, but every time I opened my mouth, the words tangled and died. What if they looked at me the way Thomas had, with hunger and possession? What if trust was just another trap? So I stayed on the edges. I smiled politely, nodded when spoken to, and buried myself in books. Literature became my refuge. In those pages, I found characters who survived wars, betrayals, and heartbreak. Some even found love again. I underlined passages that felt like pieces of myself, filling notebook margins with scribbled thoughts. It was the first time I realized my pain wasn't singular, it was part of the messy, brutal story of humanity. One person refused to let me stay invisible. Clara. She was my roommate, a tall girl with wild curls and a laugh that shook the walls. She talked constantly about everything from her little brother's antics to her dreams of becoming a lawyer. At first she exhausted me, but she had this way of softening her voice when she saw me shrink, of making space without making me feel like a burden. "You've got secrets, don't you?" she asked one night, lying across her bed, chewing on a piece of licorice. I froze. Secrets were dangerous. Secrets destroyed. But Clara only smiled, not expecting an answer. "That's okay," she added. "Everyone does. You don't owe them to me. Just know I'm here." "Okay." Her words loosened something in me. I didn't spill everything I couldn't, but I started letting her see cracks. I told her I grew up in a strict household, that my brother was controlling, that silence was safer than speaking. She didn't press for more. She just listened, her brown eyes steady and kind. For the first time, I wondered if friendship could mean safety instead of risk. Then came Michael. He sat 2 rows over in my psychology class, always scribbling notes furiously, always raising his hand. One day after lecture, he caught up to me, grinning. "You think too much," he said. I blinked. "Excuse me." "During discussion, you had that look like you wanted to say something but didn't." He shrugged, shifting his backpack. "You should. I'd like to hear it." His smile was disarming, his eyes warm. For weeks, he found excuses to walk me back to the dorms, to ask about my classes, to sit beside me in the cafeteria. Part of me wanted to lean into it, to imagine what it would be like to be seen as something other than prey or burden. But the larger part of me recoiled. The closer he got, the louder Thomas's voice grew in my head. "You belong to me, no one else." One night when Michael brushed a strand of hair from my cheek, panic clawed at me. I shoved back from the table, muttering something about homework, and fled. My chest burned with guilt. I wasn't angry at him, but at the ghost still clutching me. I wanted love, but love felt like danger. Meanwhile, the shadows of home never let me rest. Letters arrived from my mother, her handwriting neat but shaky. She wrote about the weather, about church, about my father's health. She never mentioned Thomas. But between her lines, I could feel him. "Your brother is restless these days," she wrote once. "He misses you." The words chilled me. I hadn't written him once. Yet his absence in her letters screamed louder than her polite updates. One afternoon, I returned to the dorm to find a letter slipped under my door. My stomach dropped when I saw the handwriting Thomas's. I almost couldn't bring myself to open it. But my shaking fingers tore the envelope anyway. "Evelyn," it began, "you think you're free? But you're not. I know where you are. I could come to you anytime I want. Don't forget that." The paper trembled in my hands. He had found me. He was reminding me that the past wasn't behind MIT, was waiting, watching, ready to devour me again. I ripped the letter to shreds, but the words were already carved into my mind. That night, Clara found me sitting on the floor, my eyes red. She didn't ask questions. She simply sat beside me and wrapped an arm around my shoulders. For the first time, I let myself sob in someone else's presence. My body shook with years of swallowed cries, and Clara just held on, steady and quiet. When I finally calmed, she whispered, "Whatever it is, you're stronger than it." Her certainty baffled me. Stronger. I didn't feel strong. I felt like a child running from shadows. But her words stayed. Maybe strength wasn't loud or fearless. Maybe it was just surviving, one day at a time. A few weeks later, I saw him. Or at least, I thought I did. I was walking back from class when I caught sight of a tall figure leaning against a lamppost. Broad shoulders, dark hair, the same way he tilted his head when watching me. My heart stopped. My legs froze. It couldn't be him. He wouldn't come all the way here. But when I blinked, the man was gone, swallowed by the crowd. I stumbled back to the dorm, my breath ragged. Was I imagining him? Or was he really there, lurking at the edges of my new life? The uncertainty was worse than seeing him outright. At least then I'd know. The nightmares worsened. I dreamed of Thomas bursting into my dorm, of dragging me back home, of locking me away where no one could hear my screams. I woke drenched in sweat, my fists clenched so tight, my nails cut my palms. But alongside the fear, something else was growing. Anger. For so long, I'd carried guilt and shame, convinced his hold over me was my fault. Now, for the first time, I felt fury. Fury at what he'd stolen. Fury that even from miles away, he still tried to own me. That anger pushed me forward. I started writing again, not just journal entries, but essays, short stories, poems. I wrote about chains and shadows, about girls who turned their pain into fire. My professors noticed. One even submitted my essay to a campus contest without telling me. When I won, standing at the podium to read my words aloud, my voice trembled at first. But as the room leaned in, listening, I felt power thrumming through me. My story wasn't just mine anymore. It was survival given shape. Still, Thomas haunted me. Still, my mother's letters carried silence heavier than words. Still, every loud knock at the dorm door made my pulse skyrocket. But with every page I wrote, with every breath of freedom I took, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the chains could be broken. And though I didn't know it then, the fight ahead would demand every ounce of that fragile strength. Because Thomas wasn't done, and neither was I. The summer after my first year at college should have been a time to breathe, to settle into the small victories I'd earned through survival and silent endurance. But Thomas had other plans. It began subtly at first, shadow glimpsed from the corner of my eye. A car parked too long at the end of my street. A note slipped under my door with words that made my stomach turn. "You can't hide from me." The first time I read it, I froze in my dorm room, my hand trembling as I held the paper. My chest constricted, and memories from my childhood, the nights of terror, the bruises, the silences rushed back in waves. Fear had a new taste now. It was freedom threatened. I was learning, painfully, that escaping didn't erase the past. It merely carried it into new spaces. I didn't sleep that night. The wind rattled the windows of my dorm, and I imagined Thomas's green eyes glinting in the dark. His expression twisted in fury, a predator satisfied only with control. I knew he couldn't actually be here. Not physically, not yet, but the power of his presence. The long reach of his obsession was enough to make me tremble. I clutched my tin box, the one I had hidden money in my first essays in, as if it could shield me from him. Writing had always been my anchor, my way of taking control, but suddenly, even words seemed inadequate. I tried to call my mother. Her voice, soft and trembling, came through the phone. "Evelyn." She hesitated. the weight of unspoken words hanging heavily between us. Be careful, that was all. Her apology, her recognition of the horrors I had endured, had limits. Her fear was still stronger than her courage, and I understood that. But each conversation reminded me of the distance, not just the miles, but the emotional chasm separating me from anyone who could protect me. I was alone in ways I hadn't been since childhood, and yet I was determined to survive. Thomas escalated next. He called once in the middle of the night. His voice was low, calm, but under it was a cold rage that made my blood run cold. "You think distance will save you," he whispered. "I know where you sleep, Evelyn. You can run, but you'll never be free." The line went dead before I could respond. I sat on the dorm room floor, shaking my body, a knot of fear and rage. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, to crawl back into the security of invisibility. But invisibility had never saved me. I began taking precautions. I changed routines, avoided predictable patterns, walked with friends whenever I could, and even considered requesting campus security escort for late-night classes. At first, it felt humiliating. This constant vigilance, I wanted to scream that I was an adult, that I didn't need protection. But the reality was stark. The boy who had terrorized me for over a decade wasn't confined by boundaries or distance. The past I had tried to escape was not content to remain behind. Despite the fear, I found solace in small victories. I began standing taller, walking more confidently, asserting myself in ways I hadn't dared before. In my creative writing class, I submitted a story about control and obsession. Thinly veiled fiction, but with a raw edge that made my professor's eyebrows rise. "This is compelling," she said. "Painful in a way only someone who has known fear could write." Her recognition bolstered me. I realized that turning trauma into words could be a weapon against fear, a way to reclaim power over experiences meant to break me. Yet every time I thought I was safe, Thomas reminded me that freedom was never guaranteed. One afternoon, as I returned from the library, I found a package on my dorm room desk. Inside was a small photo of me, taken from somewhere outside my window. My dorm number scribbled in the corner. Panic rose in my chest like a living thing. I called campus security immediately, filed a report, and even considered reporting it to the police. But fear whispered relentlessly, "They won't believe you. They won't understand him. You're on your own." Despite these threats, I refused to retreat completely. I had spent too long hiding, too long shrinking. I began to research ways to protect myself. Self-defense classes, restraining orders, legal measures, anything that might give me a chance against him. Every class I took, every page I read about personal safety was a small rebellion. It was proof that the years of fear had not completely conquered me. I was learning to fight back in ways subtle and deliberate, shaping a plan for survival that wasn't based solely on hiding that summer. I reconnected with Clara. She noticed the tension, the way I flinched at shadows, the way I jumped at every sudden noise. I confided in her more than I ever had before. Not every detail, but enough for her to understand that this was no ordinary fear. She didn't question or judge. She simply offered support, a lifeline I could grasp without fear of it snapping. Together, we developed routines, signals, and ways to keep me connected while ensuring safety. The solidarity of friendship, the knowledge that someone else recognized the danger, became a crucial anchor. But Thomas wasn't idle. He began sending messages through mutual acquaintances, subtle, veiled threats meant to keep me off balance. "I hope college is treating you well," one read. On its own, it seemed harmless, but the subtext was unmistakable. He was watching, and he had the power to intrude anywhere. My heart raced at the thought. My body remembered years of his presence, his whispers, his hands. The trauma had etched itself so deeply that even distance couldn't erase its mark. One night, I awoke to the sound of footsteps outside my dorm room window. My body froze, pulse pounding. I ran to the window and saw nothing but the empty quad bathed in moonlight. But the fear lingered, twisting in my chest, reminding me that even here I wasn't completely safe. I started locking windows, installing additional locks, and keeping my phone by my side at all times. Independence had a price. Vigilance, yet amidst the terror, I discovered a new resilience. I began writing with ferocity, pouring years of buried pain into essays, poems, and short stories. Each word became a battle cry, each sentence a step toward reclaiming my autonomy. I entered writing contests, shared my work with professors, and for the first time, felt the thrill of being seen on my own terms. The recognition, the applause, and the acknowledgement were intoxicating, but also terrifying. It was proof that I could exist beyond the shadow Thomas cast. That fall, I took a self-defense course. I learned how to anticipate, how to react, how to strike. At first, it was awkward and uncomfortable, my body untrained and hesitant. But gradually, confidence built. Punches became precise, blocks deliberate, movements practiced until muscle memory replaced fear. I realized that reclaiming physical space was intertwined with reclaiming mental space. I wasn't powerless. I had tools, knowledge, and determination. One evening, Clara and I attended a lecture on personal safety for women. The speaker, a retired detective, spoke about patterns of abuse, warning signs, and how survivors could reclaim agency. Every word resonated. I scribbled notes furiously. Ideas for how to shield myself, how to assert boundaries. The session ended, but my mind raced long after, planning, strategizing, imagining scenarios where I could move through the world without fear. Thomas's presence remained a ghost. Letters continued to arrive. Photographs sometimes slipped under my door, a lingering reminder of his obsession. And yet, the combination of preparation, strategy, and community gave me strength. I was learning that fear could be managed, even if never fully eliminated. I wasn't hiding anymore. I was equipping myself to survive, even to fight back. By the end of the year, I had transformed in subtle but profound ways. I walked taller, spoke more freely in class, and began to interact with peers without flinching at every movement. The past was never far, but it no longer dictated my every step. I had become a strategist of my own life, carefully navigating threats while claiming moments of joy and freedom. Thomas's hold had not disappeared, but his power over me was beginning to fracture. Each step I took toward independence, each measure of preparation, each connection I nurtured outside the shadow of my childhood chipped away at his control. I realized that survival was not passive endurance but active defiance, that the act of living fully and carefully was itself a rebellion, and though the road ahead was still perilous, filled with uncertainties, I had learned one vital truth. I could fight. I could protect myself. I could claim life beyond fear. The boy who had tormented me for years might linger in memory, might continue to try to assert control, but he did not define me anymore. I was Evelyn, scarred, cautious, but alive, and for the first time, I truly believed that freedom was not just a dream but a possible reality. Asterisk, by the next semester, Evelyn realized that survival wasn't just about hiding or running, it required allies, people who could see her clearly and help her navigate the dangerous shadow Thomas cast. Clara became more than a roommate. She became a confidant, someone to confide in without judgment, someone who made fear feel slightly more manageable. Evelyn began to trust her fully, sharing details she had never spoken aloud, about the control, the possessiveness, and the moments that had haunted her for over a decade. Clara listened quietly, absorbing every word, offering strength simply through her presence. At the same time, Evelyn discovered a campus support group for survivors of abuse. She hesitated at first, terrified that someone might judge her, that her past would make her seem weak or shameful. But when she attended the first meeting, she found herself surrounded by voices like hers, people who had survived, who had been silenced, and who were now speaking out. Listening to their stories, she realized she wasn't alone. The shame she had carried for so long began to lift, replaced by a growing sense of determination. She spoke sparingly at first, sharing small pieces of her experience, but each word released some of the fear she had carried for years. Her mother's letters continued to arrive, less frequent now, but each one carrying the weight of unspoken truths. One day, Evelyn received a letter that was different. The handwriting trembled, but the words were clear. Evelyn, you are brave. I have been silent too long, but I believe in you. Be careful and know you are not alone. The words struck her like sunlight through storm clouds. For the first time, she felt her mother's support as something more than fear, a faint but real shield. Against the shadow of Thomas. Evelyn also began working with a campus security officer, Officer Ramirez, a stern but fair man who specialized in personal safety for students. She explained the letters, the photos, and the fear that lingered even miles away. He listened carefully, taking notes, advising her on protective measures, campus alerts, and ways to document any contact Thomas might attempt. The sense of having a professional ally was new and terrifying at first. She had never allowed anyone official into her life so completely. But Officer Ramirez proved trustworthy, methodical, and calm. And slowly, Evelyn allowed herself to lean on him. Learning that asking for help didn't make her weak, it made her stronger. Despite the support, Thomas's presence continued to loom. The letters became less frequent but more threatening, each one carefully calculated to remind her that he could strike fear even at a distance. Evelyn realized that escaping him physically had not been enough. She had to anticipate, to strategize, to reclaim agency at every turn. She installed locks on every window, changed her routines, and avoided predictable patterns. Every step she took became deliberate, a dance of freedom balanced with caution. One evening, Evelyn received a call from Clara. "We need to talk," she said. She sounded urgent. Evelyn hurried to the dorm, heart pounding. Clara had done research on ways to protect survivors of stalking and abuse. She had compiled lists of legal resources, self-defense classes, and safe houses. Evelyn realized that for the first time, she was not alone in planning her survival. Together, they began mapping out strategies to ensure she could maintain independence while minimizing risk. Evelyn also explored therapy. Speaking with Dr. Harmon, a psychologist who specialized in trauma, became another lifeline. She learned to confront the fear she had carried for years, to name the power Thomas had over her, and to develop mental strategies to reclaim autonomy. Dr. Harmon emphasized small steps, deliberate boundaries, and the importance of reclaiming emotional and mental that had been controlled by fear. Every session peeled away layers of shame and guilt that had defined her for so long. As the semester progressed, Evelyn realized that she was no longer merely surviving. She was strategizing. She carried herself with a quiet confidence, aware of threats but no longer paralyzed by them. She began volunteering in support programs for survivors, sharing her story selectively, empowering others while reinforcing her own strength. Each time she spoke, she reclaimed a piece of herself stolen long ago. Thomas's shadow remained, a lurking threat that would never fully disappear. But Evelyn had allies: Clara, Officer Ramirez, Dr. Harmon, and even the small support network she had begun building among her peers. For the first time, fear existed alongside strength, not as an overwhelming force, but as a caution to be navigated. That summer, she began saving more aggressively, planning for a permanent escape from the reach of her past. Scholarships, part-time work, and careful budgeting became tools of liberation. Every dollar saved, every precaution taken, every word written in her journals was a brick in the foundation of a life that Thomas could not touch. Evelyn's growth was slow but undeniable. She still flinched at sudden noises, still felt panic at the memory of his hands or eyes. But she had discovered resilience she hadn't known existed. A capacity to plan, act, and protect herself that had been dormant for too long. Allies, preparation, and courage were no longer abstract concepts. They were lifelines, enabling her to take steps toward safety without being paralyzed by fear. By the end of Part 5, Evelyn understood something profound. She might never erase the shadow of Thomas completely, but she could reclaim her life from it. Strength was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act in spite of it. And for the first time, she truly believed that she could survive and, perhaps even thrive beyond, the reach of the boy who had haunted her childhood. The breaking point didn't come with a bang. It came quietly, like a shadow stretching longer than expected, until it loomed over every corner of my life. Thomas had been silent for months, sending only cryptic notes and photographs. Enough to make my skin crawl, but not enough to make me panic. But then, one evening, as I returned from a late writing workshop, I found a note slipped under my dorm door in familiar, jagged handwriting. "You think you're safe? I'm closer than you realize." My stomach dropped as if it had forgotten how to exist. Fear was no longer just memory or imagination. It was tangible, pressing into my chest like a living weight. I ran to Clara's room, shaking uncontrollably. She grabbed my hands, steadying me as I tried to explain, words tumbling out faster than my mind could process. "He knows, Clara. He knows everything. He's watching me. He could be anywhere." Clara's calm eyes met mine. "Then we fight smart," she said firmly. "Not just with fear. We plan, we act. You're not alone." Her confidence was an anchor, but even with her support, I felt the old terror clawing its way back, raw and sharp, reminding me of every night I had spent hiding in my own home. Praying that Thomas wouldn't come too close that night, sleep refused me. Every creak, every wind against the window sounded like him. Shadows elongated into his form, and my mind replayed memories I had tried to bury: the hands on my shoulders, the possessive gaze, the suffocating control. Panic surged until I was hyper-aware of every detail in my dorm. The locks, the windows, the doors, every precaution I had learned felt simultaneously comforting and insufficient. I realized, with cold clarity, that no matter what I did, Thomas's obsession could reach me. Fear had evolved into a constant companion, a predator without face or body, waiting to pounce in moments of distraction. The next week I received a phone call from an unknown number. My heart froze as I answered. A familiar low voice, calm but lethal, whispered, "You're making me wait too long. I've watched you grow, learned your routines, and now it's time you remember who owns you." The line went dead, leaving me trembling, my hands gripping the receiver like it could somehow shield me from him. Officer Ramirez insisted I document everything, report the call, and stay vigilant. But the terror didn't end there. It had seeped into my bones, anchoring itself in the deepest recesses of my mind. Clara refused to leave my side. We developed codes, signals, and escape routes, memorizing every path through campus that could be used to flee if needed. We discussed cameras, alarms, and self-defense tactics. Yet each preparation reminded me how serious the threat was. For the first time, the danger was no longer hypothetical. It had crossed from memory into the present. Every step outside my room, every casual glance over my shoulder became part of a constant calculation. Survival was now a full-time mental occupation, draining and exhausting. One evening, after a long day of classes, I received a package containing an old photograph of my childhood bedroom, the room I had shared with Thomas. The dolls on the shelves, the drawings on the walls, the very space where my innocence had been stolen, all captured in a single snapshot. It was a deliberate message. He remembered, he was watching, he had not forgotten. I sank to the floor, tears blurring my vision. The past and present collided violently, and for the first time, I questioned whether I could endure the intensity of this pursuit. Panic made rational thought nearly impossible. I wanted to flee, to disappear, to undo every step I had taken toward independence, yet something inside refused to collapse. I thought of Clara, of Officer Ramirez, of the small but growing network of allies and friends who had supported me through each stage of this nightmare. I thought of Dr. Harmon's advice: strength is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act, despite it. I realized that the breaking point wasn't just about surviving fear, it was about asserting control over it. However small the victories might seem, the turning moment came when I decided to confront the reality of Thomas's obsession directly. I filed reports with campus security, provided every piece of evidence, and even involved local law enforcement. It was terrifying to put tangible proof into the hands of others, knowing that once documented, it could provoke a reaction from him. But I also knew that ignoring him no longer protected MIT, only gave him power. By naming the threat, by making him accountable, I reclaimed a fragment of agency I had been denied for so many years. Self-defense became more than a class. It became a ritual. I trained relentlessly, sparring, practicing maneuvers, rehearsing scenarios in my mind. Each movement, each block and strike, was a reclamation of space that he had once dominated. My body, once a vessel of fear, became a tool of empowerment. I realized that physical preparation was inseparable from mental preparation. Strength and vigilance had to coexist. The breaking point also forced me to examine the emotional toll. Sleep remained fraught, panic lurked at unexpected moments, and even the presence of friends could trigger Therapy sessions with Dr. Harmon became a lifeline, a place to untangle fear from reality, to remind myself that although Thomas's influence was profound, it was not absolute. Through careful guidance, I learned to recognize triggers, anchor myself in the present, and gradually reclaim emotional stability. By the end of the semester, I could no longer ignore the reality that Thomas's obsession was relentless. Yet the combination of allies, preparation, therapy, and writing fortified me. I had reached a point where fear could no longer paralyze me completely. Instead, it became a signal, a reminder to stay vigilant, to plan strategically, and to act decisively. The breaking point had not shattered me. It had forged a new resilience. I was still terrified. Thomas's shadow lingered in letters, in nightmares, and in moments of sudden panic. But I was no longer the powerless child cowering in a bedroom, nor the fledgling adult overwhelmed by memory. I had become an active participant in my own survival, capable of asserting boundaries, enlisting support, and reclaiming space that had long been dominated by fear. Every step I took, every measure I implemented, was a rebellion against the years of control he had exerted. The breaking point, I realized, was not a singular event, it was a process. It was the accumulation of fear, threats, and terror, met with deliberate action, courage, and resourcefulness. It was the moment when survival shifted from mere endurance to strategy, from panic to empowerment. And in that shift, I discovered something profound. I was not defined by his obsession, nor by the trauma of my past. I was defined by my ability to act, to survive, and to fight back, even in the face of relentless fear. After months of fear, preparation, and small victories, Evelyn realized that hiding and surviving was no longer enough. Survival alone was passive. She needed to fight back. Each day, she meticulously tracked her routines, noting patterns that Thomas could exploit. She varied her schedule, changed routes, and avoided predictable locations. Every step became deliberate, a calculated defense rather than a reactive panic. The knowledge that she could plan, anticipate, and act was intoxicating, an early taste of freedom that Thomas could not take away. Clara remained her steadfast ally. Together, they mapped out escape routes, not only from the campus but from town. If Thomas attempted to appear in person, they devised emergency signals: a knock, a message, a call. Every precaution was a small declaration. I am reclaiming my life and I refuse to be powerless. At first, the constant strategizing was exhausting. Every day required vigilance, mental calculation, and emotional restraint. But with each precaution, Evelyn felt a growing sense of control. and understanding that she was no longer solely a victim but an architect of her own safety. Evelyn also expanded her network. Officer Ramirez helped her connect with local law enforcement specializing in stalking and domestic abuse. Through them, she learned legal measures. She could take restraining orders, emergency contacts, and documentation practices. These steps were empowering in a way that running and hiding had never been. Finally, fear could coexist with action. Finally, the shadow of Thomas could be met with resistance. Not just trembling and evasion, self-defense training intensified. Evelyn's body, once tense and rigid from trauma, now moved with precision and confidence. Each sparring session, each strike, each block reinforced a vital truth. She was reclaiming territory, both physical and psychological, that had been denied for years. The memory of Thomas's hands on her shoulders, his predatory gaze, became fuel. A reminder of why she could never allow herself to feel powerless again. In every movement, she transformed fear into strength. Writing remained another form of rebellion. Evelyn channeled her experiences into essays, short stories, and poetry, some of which she shared with professors, some kept private as a personal ledger of resilience. Words became armor, a way to confront the trauma she had endured and assert her identity beyond Thomas's control. Each paragraph she wrote, each narrative she shaped, reinforced the growing belief that she could survive and thrive. She was no longer just the scared girl from Oak Ridge. She was a survivor, a strategist, and a fighter. The confrontation escalated when Thomas attempted to reach her indirectly through social media. He sent cryptic messages via mutual contacts, attempting to intimidate and manipulate. But Evelyn refused to respond with panic. Instead, she meticulously documented everything, providing clear evidence to law enforcement and Officer Ramirez. Each message, each attempt, was a challenge that she met with preparation rather than fear. She realized that confrontation didn't require direct combat. It could be strategic, calculated, and effective. One night, after another indirect threat from Thomas, Evelyn sat at her desk and wrote a letter not to send, but to release the fear and anger bottled inside her. She described every moment of terror, every manipulation, every lost year. By the time she finished, tears streaked her face, but she felt lighter. The act of externalizing her trauma, of naming it fully, was a potent form of resistance. It reminded her that fear could not exist unchecked. Expression and strategy could counteract it. By this time, Evelyn's confidence was becoming visible. She no longer flinched at shadows or sudden noises. When she walked through campus, she held her head high, aware of potential danger but refusing to let it dictate her posture or presence. Each small action, a smile, a greeting, a classroom answer, was a statement of reclaiming autonomy. Thomas might lurk in memory or distance, but she was asserting that her life, her identity, and her choices belonged to her, not him. The culmination of this fightback period came when Evelyn, with the support of Officer Ramirez, filed a formal restraining order. The process was nerve-wracking. Legal forms, statements, and recounting experiences in explicit detail. But each step reinforced a vital realization. Fear could be managed through preparation and action. She was learning to meet threat with strategy, emotion with calculation, and terror with strength. Thomas's obsession was not erased, but it could be contained. Clara remained a constant witness and supporter, validating each victory and helping absorb the weight of fear. Therapy continued to provide a mental framework for understanding trauma, reclaiming emotional autonomy, and building resilience. Evelyn combined strategy, emotional processing, and physical training to create a life that, while cautious, was no longer defined by the past. By the end of this chapter in her life, Evelyn had transformed. She was no longer a passive target of fear or memory. She had become proactive, prepared, and empowered. Each measure she took, legal, physical, emotional, or social, was a step toward reclaiming the life Thomas had tried to control. Every small victory reinforced a new truth. She could exist, thrive, and reclaim agency in the face of lingering threats. Evelyn knew the battle wasn't over. Thomas's shadow would never fully disappear. But now it was a shadow she could navigate with eyes open, with allies, with preparation, and with courage. She had become her own protector, her own strategist, her own advocate. And in that transformation, she discovered a profound truth. Survival was not merely enduring, it was reclaiming, resisting, and thriving in the face of persistent fear. The day Evelyn realized she was truly free came quietly, without fanfare, but with the profound clarity of survival finally achieved. Months of planning, legal action, and careful preparation culminated in a life that Thomas could no longer reach. The restraining order had been enforced and his indirect threats had ceased. For the first time in decades, she felt the absence of constant fear, not because the past had been erased, but because she had claimed agency over it. Evelyn moved into a small apartment off campus, a space that she alone controlled. Every item, every detail reflected her choice. a desk for writing, shelves for books that inspired courage, photographs of her journey, and objects that reminded her of victories over fear. The apartment was modest but felt sacred, a territory entirely her own. Here, she could breathe, work, and dream without the constant intrusion of memory or obsession. Therapy sessions continued, helping her navigate residual trauma and cultivate emotional resilience. Dr. Harmon reminded her that healing was ongoing and not linear. Setbacks could happen, but the tools she had developed, training, self-defense, preparation, and community, would help her manage them. Evelyn began journaling more extensively, capturing the nuances of daily victories, small acts of courage, and moments of joy she had once believed were forbidden to her. Her writing began to flourish. Now infused with lived experience, stories she had once written in fear were now written with strength and clarity, exploring themes of survival, autonomy, and resilience. Professors encouraged her to submit her work for publication. The idea that her pain could be transformed into art, into narratives that might help others, was empowering. Each word she wrote was a declaration. I exist on my own terms. Clara remained her anchor. The two of them celebrated milestones quietly, an evening of shared laughter. A walk through a park, a long conversation about hopes and fears, friendship, trust, and shared history became Evelyn's refuge, reminding her that bonds could be chosen, not imposed. Unlike the family that had silenced her, these relationships were built on equality, mutual respect, and protection. The freedom Evelyn experienced was not merely physical. She began engaging more confidently with the world, attending lectures, socializing carefully, exploring new hobbies. Every public interaction was both a test and a triumph. She still flinched at sudden movements, still recoiled at shadows, but the fear was now contained. She had learned to act in spite of it, not be paralyzed by it. Evelyn's relationship with her mother remained complicated. Letters and occasional phone calls carried gratitude and sorrow, gratitude for support finally expressed, sorrow for years of silence. They met once, hesitantly, in a neutral location. Conversation was awkward but necessary. Evelyn recognized that closure did not require forgiveness, only acknowledgement. She had survived, and that was sufficient by the end of this chapter. Evelyn had established routines, security measures, and a life that belonged to her. She had transformed fear into vigilance, trauma into resilience, and silence into voice. Thomas's shadow lingered in memory, but it no longer dictated her choices. Freedom, she realized, was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. And in that understanding, she discovered a new life waiting to be embraced. Years later, sitting on the porch of her modest home on a warm July afternoon, Evelyn reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the childhood spent in fear, the manipulation and obsession of Thomas, the silence of her parents, and the slow, painful path toward survival. Every scar, visible or hidden, told a story not just of trauma, but of resilience, strategy, and courage. She remembered the moment when she first began sharing her story with others. Tentatively at first, in therapy with Clara, and then through writing. Every word spoken or written was an act of defiance, a way of reclaiming the voice that had been silenced for decades. She realized that telling her story was not merely cathartic, it was a responsibility. There were girls and women still trapped in cycles of fear, still silenced by those who should have protected them. Her voice could reach them, even if only to whisper, "You are not alone." Evelyn had built a life defined by her choices. Writing became her career. Therapy and mentorship became her passions, and friendship became her foundation. She spoke at workshops for survivors of abuse, sharing practical strategies and emotional lessons. Each lecture, each story, each conversation was a small act of empowerment, a way to turn fear into guidance for others. Reflection brought clarity. She had not only survived but transformed. The girl who had once hidden in her bedroom, terrified of the hands that should have protected her, had become a woman of agency, courage, and strategy. Fear was no longer a prison but a tool, a signal to act, a reminder to prepare, and a catalyst for growth. She also reflected on forgiveness, not in the sense of excusing the past, but in freeing herself from the weight of it. She could acknowledge her parents' failures without letting them define her life. She could remember Thomas's control without being controlled by it. Freedom, she realized, was not just the absence of external threats. It was the reclamation of mind, body, and spirit. Evelyn smiled as she watched the sunset. The sky painted in shades of orange and pink. She thought of Clara, of mentors, of friends, and of strangers who had believed her story. Each person, each connection had contributed to her reclamation. The past, though painful, had forged her strength. The scars were permanent, but they were also proof of survival, evidence of resilience, and markers of courage. In the quiet of her porch, Evelyn knew her story was not just hers, it was a beacon for anyone trapped by fear or silence. She had turned trauma into empowerment, fear into strategy, and survival into a blueprint for life. The journey had been long, painful, and fraught with danger, but it had led to an undeniable truth. Even in the darkest circumstances, it was possible to reclaim life, to fight back, and to thrive. And as she leaned back, watching the evening stars emerge, Evelyn whispered to herself and to anyone who might hear, "You can survive. You can reclaim yourself. You can be stronger than your fear."